Good question. So the question is, I speak of this new way of being human that Jesus actually taught us about or ushered in. What does that mean? What do I mean when I say a new way of being human? My community has done a ton of work on that. As a matter of fact, someone like you came up to me like 4 years ago and said, hey, Jerry, you talk about a new way of being human, or you talk about following in the way of Jesus, and you speak of it as though you know what you're talking about, but I'm not sure that any of us really know what you're talking about. And so I went to our community of elders and just said, okay, what do we mean when we say following in the way of Jesus? What do we mean when we say Jesus came to demonstrate a new way of being human? What did that look like? And so it turned us onto a whole journey together as a community, where we just went to the Gospels hard together with our community of elders, and we were just simply mining for what was the way of Jesus. And if we could distill the way of Jesus, not as a new equation that we apply to our lives and then we don't need Jesus anymore, but if we're to actually look at the way that Jesus lived, understanding that he came to demonstrate a new way of being human, what are the words or the practices that we would use to describe it? And we came up with 4. Ready? Okay. First and foremost, we recognize that Jesus was rooted in the love of the Father. Jesus' activity was driven by the connection that he had with the Father. Jesus, if you think about the baptism moment, the most notable part of that story is when he hears the voice of the Father saying, "You are my beloved Son." And so therefore, Jesus knew who he was, and he was connected to that. And so there's a rootedness. A new way of being human begins with being rooted in Christ. Us recognizing whose we are, and what we're finding is that the more confident we become in whose we are, the less we care what other people think about us. And that is a liberating reality. I mean, if you look at the life of Jesus, everything that I just taught during the gathering today, this is a Jesus who does not care what people think about him. This is a Jesus who is so committed to the way of the Father, and he's so committed to redemption and reconciliation that he's upsetting he's disturbing the peace to bring peace. The reason he could do that the way that he did that starts with the fact that he knew whose he was, and he was confident. He knew what God thought about him, and so it didn't matter what you thought about him. What mattered was that he knew what God thought about him. So the rootedness is the first piece. And then there are all sorts of different practices that we've created at Open Door to help actually grow rootedness in us. And some of these are just the ancient practices. I mean, it's not like we don't need to recreate the wheel. I mean, followers of Jesus have been finding ways to be rooted in Christ for 2,000 plus years, So a new way of being human starts with being rooted. Then woven together as family. This is the second piece. We just recognize that Jesus didn't come and do anything in isolation. There was some solitude, but there's a big difference between solitude and isolation. Solitude seems to be in the vocabulary of the God life. Isolation doesn't. Isolation is usually seen as a bad thing in the scriptures. So there's solitude, but when Jesus came, he didn't do anything independently. He did things in community. So really the first work that he does is he builds up a community. Mark chapter 3, he redefines family. If you remember, he's teaching in, I think, Simon's house up in Capernaum, and someone comes and says, "Hey, Jesus, your mom and your brothers are here." And he goes, "Who's my mom? Who's my brothers?" "These are my mothers and brothers." In other words, Jesus redefines family not as bloodline, but as people who orient their lives around him. I want to make a distinction here, though, that Jesus didn't just invite a group of friends and chill with them for 3 years. He invited a community, and then they became woven together as family. It was a mutually interdependent community of people. They practiced submitted to God and mutually submitted to one another. That's a new way of being human, which is a great distance from the independence, myopic experience of being a U.S. American today, where it's really about the postmodern trinity of me, myself, and I. So a new way of being human is you're actually woven together as family. Third thing, Jesus' entire life was marked by sacrificial love. He just simply poured out his life in healthy and sustainable ways. He didn't do it in ways that just ultimately killed him. But that in and of itself was an act of love, and so not masochistic, but self-sacrificial. And so everything that Jesus is doing is an extension of love. Why? Because he recognized this is what God is like. moving into the wrong places and into the lives of the wrong people. This is what God is like. Meeting practical needs. This is what God is like. So his whole life is marked by extending sacrificial love. Again, we see him featured in a lot of that, but he's doing that in the context of community, and then he sends his folks to go and do likewise, right? So there's this community aspect, this family aspect too. So the family isn't a whole bunch of people who extend sacrificial love. The family itself that's woven together is marked in the shape of the cross. Their expression of life is sacrificial. Okay, new way of being human, which is different than self-preservation and grow your platform, grow your power, grow your abundance, grow your influence. No, like the way of Jesus, new way of being human is give it away for the sake of others. And then the last piece, we just watched Jesus teach other people how to do it too. And so he's rooted, he's woven, he's extending, and then in living this life, he doesn't take them to the academy to teach them about these things. He invites them into his life and teaches them how to do it. And so a new way of being human is not this, I'm going to get like a big, huge, cerebral fest and just be smart. His whole thing was, no, I'm gonna live this way, and I'm gonna invite people into my life, and I'm going to teach them by living this way with them. And so the rooted, woven, extending, and the word we use there is cultivating. These are the things that we see make up Jesus' life, and this is a picture of a new way of being human.